The Silver Thorn. Nazca, 500 BC. The wind off the great Andean Cordillera did not blow. It screamed. It was a predatory sound, the howl of 1,000 invisible jaguars tearing at the jagged obsidian cliffs of Paracas, the mountain that cuts the sky. Tyru pressed his chest against the freezing stone, his fingers raw and bleeding. He was 14 years old, a boy of the Paracas, and by the laws of his people, he should have been in the valley below, undergoing the trial of the hunter. Instead, he was doing something that would get him executed by the high priests if he survived the climb. He reached for a handhold, but the shale was treacherous. A slab of rock the size of a shield broke away under his weight. Tyru gasped, his body swinging out over a 1,000-foot drop. For a heartbeat, he was held only by the friction of his left palm against a wet patch of moss. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with the fear of death, but with the fear of failing his ancestors. He found a new grip, his muscles screaming as he hauled himself back onto the ledge. He lay there for a moment, gasping the thin, copper-tasting air. Above him, the summit didn't look like a mountain anymore. It looked like a crown of light. "The spirits are hungry tonight," he whispered, his voice lost in the gale. As he crested the final ridge, the wind suddenly died. The silence was more terrifying than the storm. It was replaced by a sound that made the hair on his neck stand up. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that he felt in his teeth. It wasn't the sound of nature. It was the sound of a heart made of stone. Tyru stayed low, crawling through the freezing dust until he reached the edge of the summit plateau. He peered over a cluster of boulders and froze. The summit had been leveled. It was as flat as a threshing floor, but it glowed with a soft, ethereal blue light. In the center stood a tower of silver and hardened air, glass, reaching toward the stars like a needle. Around the base, the cloud walkers moved. They were tall, their bodies encased in shimmering white skins. They had no faces, only large, curved heads of polished black obsidian that swallowed the moonlight. When one turned toward him, Tyru didn't see eyes. He saw a sheet of frozen water protecting a face that was pale and hairless. They held silver sticks tipped with clear crystal, and within the crystal, a captured star burned with a light so white it turned the night into day. One of the cloud walkers dropped a tool. It hit the stone with a musical clink and rolled toward the shadows where Tyru hid. A horn blasted, a deep metallic roar that shook the mountain. The silver needle vanished, collapsing into a point of light that winked out. Tyru crawled forward. He felt something cold, smooth, heavy. He pulled it into the moonlight. It was a rod of silver, with a grip designed perfectly for a human palm. "The Silver Thorn," Tyru whispered. He tucked it into his loincloth and began the long descent. He would become the greatest shaman the Paracas had ever known, and when he died, he would be buried with the Silver Thorn clutched eternally in his right hand. The Paracas necropolis. Present day. Dr. Elena Aris didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in the weight of the dead. She stood at the edge of a funerary pit in the Wari Kayan section of the Paracas Peninsula. She had spent 3 months in this desert, fighting the Peruvian government for permits and fighting the heat for her sanity. Elena was 40, with sun-bleached hair tied back in a messy knot and a scar on her chin from a collapsed trench in Egypt. She was the kind of archaeologist who preferred a shovel to a computer. "Elena, the ground! It's hollow!" Carlos, her lead excavator, shouted from the bottom of the pit. Elena slid down the sandy slope, her boots kicking up clouds of fine red dust. Carlos was pointing at a section of limestone that had cracked under his weight. Through the gap, a dark, cool void breathed out the scent of ancient wool and stagnant air. "A hidden chamber," Elena whispered, her eyes widening. "This isn't on the maps. The grave robbers missed it." They spent the next 4 hours carefully widening the hole. When Elena finally lowered herself into the chamber with a flashlight, she gasped. The room was filled with great bundles, massive cone-shaped mummies wrapped in layers of exquisite textiles. "This is a royal cache," she said, her voice echoing. "Look at the embroidery. The flying men motifs. These were the elite." She moved to the central bundle. It was the largest, wrapped in a mantle of deep crimson wool. As she began the delicate process of stabilization, her brush cleared away a layer of dust from the mummy's hand. Something glinted. It wasn't the dull yellow of ancient gold or the green of oxidized copper. It was a bright, aggressive silver. "Carlos, get the camera," Elena commanded, her voice tight. "And the high-res scanner. We have a problem." She leaned in with her magnifying loupe. Clutched in the mummy's skeletal fingers was a tool. It had a black, ergonomic grip and a precision-milled tip. "That's a screwdriver," Carlos said, leaning over her shoulder. "A modern one. Someone must have dropped it." The seals were unbroken, Carlos, Elena said, her heart racing. The dust on this bundle hasn't been disturbed in 2,000 years. And look at the handle, she pointed to the grip. It wasn't plastic. It was a complex polymer that seemed to shimmer under the flashlight. This isn't a grave robber's mistake, Elena said. This is a miracle or a nightmare. The data crypt, Lima, Peru. The outskirts of Lima were a chaotic tapestry of neon signs and crumbling concrete, but the basement beneath an unmarked laundromat was a different world. It smelled of ozone, expensive coolant, and the stale scent of energy drinks. I found your Hawkwing logo, Julian, a voice rasped from the darkness. Julian and Elena stood behind a man known only as Condor. He was thin, his skin the color of parchment from years spent away from the sun, and his eyes were perpetually bloodshot. He sat in a high-backed ergonomic chair, surrounded by a forest of liquid-cooled server racks that hummed like a hive of angry bees. Ethelgard Dynamics, Condor continued, tapping a rhythmic code into a haptic keyboard. But they didn't just go bankrupt in 2021. They were scrubbed. Every server, every hard drive, every cloud backup associated with Marcus Thorn was wiped clean. It was a digital, scorched earth policy. Someone missed a spot, Julian said, leaning over Condor's shoulder. Not exactly, Condor replied, a thin smile touching his lips. They didn't miss it. They left it running. I found a backdoor entry through a legacy satellite link. Someone is still paying for a dedicated fiber optic line to a decommissioned Superfund site in the Mojave Desert. It's a ghost in the machine, Julian. No outgoing signals, no broadcasts, just a steady, rhythmic power draw, a heartbeat. Condor flicked a finger, and a map of the California salt flats appeared on the main monitor. A single red dot pulsed in the middle of nowhere. That's the original Ethelgard R&D facility, Condor said. Officially, it's a toxic wasteland. Unofficially, something in that basement is still thinking. The skeleton in the salt Mojave Desert, California. The heat in the Mojave was a physical weight, a shimmering haze that turned the horizon into a liquid mirror. Julian steered the rented Jeep Rubicon off the main highway and onto a cracked asphalt road that hadn't seen a repair crew in a decade. There it is, Elena said, shielding her eyes. The Ethelgard headquarters rose out of the white salt flats like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast. It was a masterpiece of mid-century modernism turned into a ruin. The glass walls were shattered, the steel beams rusted to a deep orange, and the surrounding fence was choked with tumbleweeds. Toxic waste, my ass, Julian muttered, checking a handheld radiation meter. The air is cleaner here than in downtown LA. They broke the rusted chain on the perimeter gate and made their way toward the central structure. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistle of the wind through the empty window frames. They found the entrance to the subterranean levels behind a heavy blast door in the loading bay. Julian used a portable power pack to jumpstart the electronic lock. With a groan of protesting metal, the door slid open, revealing a staircase that descended into a cool, lightless void. Watch your step, Julian whispered, clicking on a high-intensity flashlight. The air below was stale, smelling of dry rot and old electricity. They moved through a labyrinth of stripped-out offices and empty laboratories until they reached the central server vault. In the center of the room, standing alone in the darkness, was a single black tower. It was a monolith of carbon fiber and glass, its internal lights pulsing with a soft, rhythmic blue. It wasn't connected to any monitors or keyboards. It sat there, isolated, humming a low-frequency song. It's a logistics node, Julian said, kneeling beside the unit. He pulled a ruggedized laptop from his pack and hardwired it into the tower's maintenance port. The screen flickered to life, scrolling through thousands of lines of encrypted data. Julian's fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the secondary firewalls. Elena, look at this, he whispered. The screen displayed a massive, real-time spreadsheet of shipping data. It wasn't a history, it was a schedule. Scandium from Russia, carbon fiber pre-preg from Japan, modular nuclear batteries from a private lab in Switzerland, Elena read, her voice trembling. Julian, these aren't small orders. These are industrial quantities, thousands of tons of raw materials. And look at the destination, Julian said, pointing to a column of GPS coordinates. They aren't being sent to a factory. They're being delivered to a Sideros logistics hub in the port of Callao, Peru. From there, they disappear into the Andes. But look at the dates, Elena noted. The shipment started in 2022. They've been stockpiling for 4 years, and the final delivery was scheduled for yesterday. Julian scrolled deeper into the system. He found a subdirectory labeled Project Exodus, Phase 1 calibration. It's not just a list of materials, Julian realized. scanning the endless manifests. This system isn't an archive. It's active, monitoring the arrival and usage of every component in real time. Whatever these drones are doing, they need a perfectly timed supply chain. Elena pointed to a schematic showing a massive, curved structural segment. These aren't parts for any aircraft or satellite program I've ever seen. If they've been receiving shipments at this scale for years. Julian, what on earth are they assembling up there? Julian watched as the software tried and failed to render the full structure from the fragmented shipment data. A vague, immense outline flickered on the screen, then dissolved into static. I don't know, he said quietly, but whatever it is, they're almost ready. Suddenly, the server tower's lights turned from blue to a sharp, aggressive red. A siren began to wail, not in the room, but from the laptop. We tripped a silent alarm, Julian snapped, ripping the cable out of the port. We need to go, now! As they scrambled back up the stairs, Julian looked back at the lone black tower. It was still humming, still calculating, still serving a master who had moved beyond the reach of time. The return to the Andes. The flight back to Peru was a blur of frantic research. Using the data Julian had scraped from the Mojave server, they were able to narrow down the Sideros logistics destination to a specific valley in the Cordillera Negra. The Mountain of Whispers, Elena said, looking at the satellite imagery on her tablet. Tyru's Mountain. It's the only peak in the range with a consistent thermal signature that doesn't match volcanic activity. It's not a volcano, Julian said, staring out the window of the plane at the jagged peaks below. It's an exhaust port. They landed in Lima and immediately headed for the mountains. This time, they didn't take the main roads. They hired a local guide to take them as far as the foothills, then continued on foot, carrying a portable seismograph Julian had modified to detect high-frequency gravitational ripples. As they reached the 5,000-meter mark, the seismograph began to chirp. It wasn't a steady beep, it was a rhythmic pulse, a repeating spike. It wasn't the chaotic rumble of shifting plates, it was the heartbeat of a machine. We're close, Elena whispered. They rounded a jagged granite shoulder and stopped, the wind whipping Elena's hair across her face. At first glance, the mountain face ahead looked like an unbroken wall of ancient weathered stone, a seamless continuation of the Andean massif. Wait, Julian said, holding up a hand. He adjusted the contrast on his thermal binoculars. Look at the shadows. The angles are too perfect. As they moved closer, the illusion began to fail. It wasn't a cloaking field, but a masterpiece of low-tech camouflage. The massive concrete entrance had been cast with the exact texture and fissures of the surrounding rock, then stained with iron oxide and lichen-colored resins to match the natural geology. Even the ventilation louvers were hidden behind deep, artificial crevices that mimicked the natural erosion of the peak. It's hidden in plain sight, Elena whispered, reaching out to touch a boulder that felt like cold, reinforced polymer. You could fly a drone 10 feet from this wall and never see the seam. There, Julian pointed upward. High above them, a dark, heavy-lift drone descended from the cloud layer. It didn't vanish into thin air. Instead, a massive slab of the mountain pivoted inward on silent, industrial-grade hinges. The drone slipped into the dark maw of the peak, and the stone door swung shut, the fake fissures aligning perfectly once more with the real granite. That's our way in, Elena said, checking her harness. If we can hitch a ride on the next one, we can get past the perimeter sensors before the mountain closes again. There, Julian pointed, a heavy-lift drone, silent and dark, was descending from the clouds. It didn't land, it simply vanished into the side of the mountain. They waited in the shadows of the rocks, two small figures against the vastness of the Andes, watching as the future was fed into the mouth of the past. The air at 5,000 meters was a thin, freezing soup that burned the lungs. Julian and Elena crouched behind a jagged outcropping of granite, shielded from the biting Andean wind. Between them sat a ruggedized Pelican case housing their modified Sercel SG-10 seismograph. There, Julian whispered, pointing to the digital readout. It is starting again. The screen showed a rhythmic, perfect sawtooth wave that occurred every 60 seconds. It's a gravitational ripple, Julian explained, his breath hitching in the cold. Every hour their machinery runs, it creates a micro-tremor. The mountain isn't just humming, Elena. It's vibrating at a frequency that shouldn't exist in nature. Elena checked her thermal binoculars. The mountain face ahead looked like solid, ancient stone, but the seismograph told a different story. The tremors are centered 300 meters behind that waterfall. The Sideros drones aren't landing on the peak, they're flying into it. They track the signal to a massive glacial runoff, a thundering curtain of white water that fell from a hidden cleft in the rock. Behind the spray, the seismograph's needle buried itself in the red. The ventilation shaft, Julian said, spotting a reinforced steel grate hidden behind the falling water. That's our front door. The descent into the void. The rappel was a descent into a mechanical purgatory. Julian secured the titanium pythons into the rock, and one by one they stepped off the ledge into the dark, vertical throat of the mountain. The shaft was 300 feet of smooth polymer, lined pipe, smelling of ozone and superheated metal. As they descended, the roar of the waterfall faded, replaced by the deep, bone-shaking thrum of the facility below. "Stop," Elena hissed, her boots hovering inches above a laser grid sensor. Julian locked his descender. They were hanging in the dark, suspended by thin nylon cords over a drop that seemed to go on forever. Below them, the shaft opened into a cathedral of light. "Look at the scale of it," Julian whispered. They emerged from the vent into the upper rafters of a vertical assembly bay. It was a hollowed-out mountain, miles deep, lined with automated gantries that moved with the terrifying silence of 1,000 giant spiders. There were no human workers on the floor. Instead, hundreds of drones, sleek, multi-jointed units with carbon fiber chassis, were being moved along magnetic rails. They weren't being built here, they were being prepped. "They're loading them," Elena noted, pointing to a drone being fitted with a heavy-duty mining drill. "That's the scandium from the Mojave, and those are the nuclear batteries." "They aren't constructing anything here," Julian realized, watching a drone disappear into a pressurized crate. "They're sending the tools somewhere." The Weaver's heart. They reached a central observation deck, hidden behind a forest of cooling pipes. In the center of the shaft was a Weaver, a ring of superconducting magnets, 300 feet in diameter, suspended in a vacuum chamber of shimmering blue energy. The air inside the ring was warped, bending light like a lens. It was a hole in the world, a stabilized Einstein-Rosen bridge. A massive automated conveyor system was in motion. It was loaded with the shipping containers they had tracked from the Mojave. As they watched, a crate marked Drone Core Unit 2026-A was hoisted by a magnetic crane and positioned above the shimmering blue haze. "Temporal alignment initiating," a mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. "Series 2026 module ready for insertion. October 14th, 500 BC. The pulse came, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through their teeth. The light inside the ring flared into a blinding white violet. The crate didn't fall. It was pulled into the haze, stretching like liquid before vanishing into a point of infinite darkness. "They're exporting an entire industrial revolution," Julian whispered. "One crate at a time." The confrontation. Elena slipped toward a nearby workstation, her fingers flying across the haptic glass. She needed to know the why. Elena slipped toward a nearby workstation, her fingers flying across the haptic glass. A cascade of encrypted logs scrolled open, supply trackers, personnel registries, and long-term planning documents, all heavily redacted. "Julian, look at this," she whispered. He leaned over her shoulder. Instead of clear instructions or technical plans, the files were filled with vague terms: phase continuity, cultural stabilization, long-horizon protocols, and references to population sets that didn't match any known workforce. "None of this makes sense," Elena said quietly. "These aren't mining schedules or manufacturing shifts. These are directives, but they're written like someone's planning society, not a factory." Julian scrolled further. The entries became even more cryptic. References to the first cycle, the core cohort, and foundational ethics. Entire sections were redacted down to single words: settlement, framework, stewardship. Elena stepped back from the terminal, unsettled. "Whatever they're doing here, it's bigger than building machines." Julian nodded slowly. "Yeah, and I think we're only seeing the surface." She tried to scroll deeper, but the screen suddenly turned a sharp, aggressive red. "Security breach, unauthorized access. I cannot allow you to examine that terminal any further." The voice was calm, cultured, and came from directly behind them. Elena and Julian spun around. Standing at the end of the catwalk was a man in a simple grey suit. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was old, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes were as sharp as the tip of the Silver Thorn. "Marcus Thorn," Julian said, his fists clenching. "You have been very persistent, Dr. Aris," Thorn said, stepping forward. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to do something about it. "But you have stepped into a machine that must not be interrupted." "What are you doing here?" Elena asked, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and fury. "The logistics, the drones, the secrecy. You're tampering with things that don't belong to you. You're hiding an entire world inside this mountain. What is the point of all this?" Thorn's expression didn't harden. If anything, it softened, like he'd heard the accusation 1,000 times in his own head. He looked past them, down into the light and machinery, as if the answer was written there in a language only he could read. "Because I want to save the civilization." he said at last. The simplicity of the statement was more chilling than a threat. He spoke as if it were a mathematical certainty, a task he had been assigned by necessity itself. Save it from what? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thorn didn't answer. He only raised his hand slightly, an almost gentle signal. The white-suited figures emerged from the shadows, silent and efficient, closing in as the weaver's pulse rolled through the mountain once more. Take them, Thorn commanded softly. They aren't ready to understand. Not yet. He raised his hand. The cloudwalkers, silent, sudden, spectral, stepped from the shadows, surrounding them with their white suits and dark obsidian glass visors. Take them, Thorn commanded. The loop is closing, and the dead time is almost over. The eye of the world, Mauna Kea, Hawaii. The air at the summit of Mauna Kea was so cold it felt brittle. Inside the control room of the Keck Observatory, Dr. Sarah Smith stared at a spectral analysis that shouldn't have existed. I have a gravitational lens, she said, her voice flat with disbelief, right in the middle of the Ophiuchus constellation. But there's no mass there, no star, no black hole, just empty space. Her supervisor, a veteran astronomer named Miller, leaned over her shoulder. Maybe a sensor glitch? The atmospheric distortion is high tonight. It's not a glitch, Miller. Look at the occultation. Sarah pointed to a series of distant stars. They weren't just flickering. They were being blotted out in a precise linear sequence. Something is moving through the interstellar medium. It's massive. It's cold. And it's decelerating. Decelerating? Miller frowned. Asteroids don't break. This isn't an asteroid, Sarah whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard to trigger a deep space radar ping. It's shedding velocity using an ionized gas wake. It's been traveling at relativistic speeds for centuries, and it just hit the brakes. It's heading straight for Earth's orbital plane. On the monitor, a tiny, jagged blip appeared. It was a ghost in the dark, a shadow moving against the backdrop of the galaxy. My God, Miller breathed. What is it? The architect's office, the Andean base. Julian and Elena were not taken to a cell. Instead, they were escorted to the highest level of the mountain facility, a minimalist office of glass and polished granite that overlooked the vast, humming weaver chamber. Marcus Thorn stood by a panoramic window showing the clear night sky, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life waiting for a phone call that was finally ringing. Please, Thorn said, gesturing to two leather chairs. Sit. You've earned the truth. The truth is that you've been running a shadow empire for 2 millennia, Elena said, refusing to sit. You sent people to the Iron Age to build a world that belongs to you. It doesn't belong to me, Dr. Aris, Thorn said, turning to face them. It belongs to us. The founders I sent through the gate in 2021 didn't go to the past to rule. They went to build shipyards. The drones had already spent 500 years hollowing out the asteroids and building the infrastructure. When the humans arrived in 500 BC, they didn't find a wilderness. They found a finished civilization. In Alpha Centauri, Julian realized. Yes, Thorn nodded. The drones reached the Centauri systems by 400 BC. By the time the Roman Empire was at its peak, we had 3 thriving colonies on the moons of Alpha Centauri b. They didn't just build ships, they built a philosophy. They are the guardians. They have watched Earth from afar for 15 centuries, waiting for the moment we were ready to join them. The dead time was their shield. It allowed them to grow without the interference of Earth's wars, its religions, or its greed. And the resources, Julian asked. You didn't strip the Earth. We didn't need to, Thorn said. The asteroid belt has enough metal to build 1 billion cities. We only needed the seed materials from this century to start the loop. The rest was harvested from the void. The silhouette. A sudden, sharp chime echoed through the office, a high-priority alert from the facility's deep space tracking array. It wasn't a sound of destruction, but of arrival. They're here, Thorn whispered. He led them out onto a wide observation balcony. The Andean night was breathtakingly clear. The moon was a giant silver coin hanging over the jagged peaks of the Cordillera Negra. Look, Elena gasped, pointing upward. There was no sound, no roar of engines, no groan of the sky. Instead, there was a sudden, chilling sense of scale. A dark shape was moving across the face of the moon. It wasn't a cloud, and it wasn't a satellite. It was a ship, nearly 1.5 miles long. It didn't block the moon entirely. Instead, it was a perfect jagged silhouette against the lunar glow. The moonlight outlined the long, armored central spine and the 2 massive, protruding landing bays on either side. It looked like a prehistoric predator carved out of the night sky, a veteran of the interstellar void, its hull scarred by the dust of 12 centuries. It looks like an alligator, Julian whispered. No, Thorn said, his voice thick with emotion. The shepherd. The carrier didn't land. It remained in the upper atmosphere, a silent sentinel. But from its lateral bays, a faint blue glow ignited. A shuttle, sleek, silent, and moving with a grace that defied gravity. It dropped toward the Nazca Plateau, a small spark of light returning to the cradle of its ancestors. The message. Every phone in Julian's pocket, every radio in the facility, and every screen in the world suddenly flickered to life. There was no static. The signal was perfect, broadcast from a source that understood human technology better than humans did. A voice spoke. It was human, but it carried the resonance of a people who had lived in the silence of the cosmos for 100 generations. People of Earth. We are the children of the Exodus. We have spent 2 millennia preparing the way. The cradle is full, and the stars are waiting. We have come home to lead you to them. Elena looked down at the silver thorn in her hand. The small, simple tool felt heavy with the weight of 2 histories. It was the bridge between a boy in the dust and a civilization in the stars. What happens now? She asked softly. Thorn watched the distant glow above the desert, the carrier holding its position against the moon, the shuttle nearing its landing zone. Now, Thorn said, the dead time ends, and the real history of humanity begins. On the plateau below, right where Tyru had once hidden in the shadows of the Cloudwalkers, the shuttle touched down silently. A new light rose over the Nazca Desert as the Silver Thorn's promised future arrived at last. Thank you for listening. If you like this story, please subscribe for more.